In the early mornings of Oak Ridge Wildlife Reserve, when the sun is just beginning to stretch its golden fingers over the horizon, there's a peaceful hush that fills the air. The winds rustle the tall grasses, and the stillness of the reserve feels like the calm before a storm. But it wasn't always like this for Maximum the lion, who would grow up to become the undisputed king of the reserve. I still remember the day I found him. I had been working as a ranger at Oak Ridge since I was 16. Living and breathing the rhythms of the wildlife every single day. But even after all those years, nothing quite prepared me for what I encountered one morning. I had just finished my early rounds, checking on the animals, when I came across a heartbreaking sight that would change my life and the life of this lion forever. Max was no bigger than a football when I first found him. He was curled up beside his mother's lifeless body, her life taken by poachers who had mercilessly shot her down. She lay there, a victim of the cruel trade that haunted the savannas, while this tiny cub, barely old enough to open his eyes, was left alone, vulnerable, and completely helpless. I could hardly breathe as I looked at him. His body was trembling, and his wide, fearful eyes locked onto mine with a mixture of confusion and abandonment. I knew in that moment, I couldn't just leave him there. I took him in. And from that day forward, Max became a part of my life. I fed him, cared for him, and kept him close, waking in the middle of the night to make sure he was fed, warm, and safe. It wasn't easy. I was still young and inexperienced. But I was determined to give him a chance at life. As Max grew stronger, I knew it was time for him to be introduced to the pride. Male lions, especially as they grow older, become solitary creatures, and I understood that it was important for him to learn how to be a lion in the wild. Even if the wild was the reserve, there were other lions here, and I hoped one of the lionesses would accept him as one of her own. It was a risky move, but I didn't want Max to become too dependent on humans. I was lucky. One of the lionesses, a fierce but gentle mother who had just had her third cub, took to him right away. It wasn't without challenges. Of course, there were moments of tension, moments when I wasn't sure if she would accept him. But she did. Slowly. Over time, I watched as Max grew up within the pride, learning the ways of his kind, becoming more and more independent. Still, I kept a close eye on him. His survival wasn't guaranteed. In the wild, lions face danger from rivals, from hunger, from disease. I knew that even within the relative safety of the reserve, Max could face challenges that would test him. There were always threats from outside, whether it was poachers or hunters trying to slip past the reserve's boundaries. But there was something about Max that made me believe he would rise above it all. As the years passed, Max became a formidable presence within the reserve. His size, his strength, and his fierce attitude earned him respect among the other lions. He wasn't just another lion, he was a dominant force. But with that power came its own set of challenges. Lions fight for territory, for dominance. And Max was no exception. I'd seen him in many skirmishes, where his enormous size and powerful build made him an intimidating opponent. It wasn't always pretty, but it was nature. And I understood that. One of the things I've always loved about the reserve is that, despite the natural challenges, there's a sense of safety here. The animals are protected from poachers, and if they need it, there's a veterinary team ready to step in. It's not perfect, but it's better than what most of them would face in the wild. And so, even though I worried about Max from time to time, especially as he ventured further away from the pride, learning to navigate the complexities of lion life, he was in the best place he could be. But even in this sanctuary, things were changing. The reserve had been experiencing an uptick in poaching attempts. While no animals had been harmed yet, the security of the reserve's boundaries had been compromised. And that left everyone, animals and rangers alike, on edge. It was during this time of increased threat that I would witness something that would forever change my understanding of Max. It was another ordinary morning. Or so I thought. I woke up early, like I always did, and set off on my rounds. The lions were the most active in the cooler parts of the day, and I had grown accustomed to seeing Max roaming the reserve, either patrolling his territory or just lounging lazily in the sun. But that morning, something was different. As I approached one of the dirt roads that wound through the reserve, I spotted him, Maximum, standing there in the distance, his golden mane rippling in the wind. His body was tense, and I could see him sniffing the air, his eyes scanning the horizon. At first, I thought it was just another day, another moment of Max being his usual, vigilant self. But then, the scent carried through the air a strange, unfamiliar scent. Max's behavior shifted. He stopped dead in his tracks, his body tensing, his muscles coiling as if he were preparing for something. It wasn't the scent of a rival lion, but something else, something far more unexpected. As I followed his gaze, I realized what had captured his attention. There, in the middle of the dirt road, was a small child no older than 3 or 4 sitting on the ground, crying. The boy was alone, abandoned, and his distress was palpable. Maximum, sensing the vulnerability of the child, began to circle him cautiously. He didn't approach, but he didn't leave either. He kept his distance, watching the boy, his pacing slow and deliberate, his golden eyes locked on the child. There was something about this moment that struck me deep in my chest. I had seen Max in many situations, but this was different. He wasn't just a lion in the wild, hunting for food or protecting his territory. He was something more. In that moment, he became a protector, a guardian of life. And it was clear to me that the bond between us wasn't just one of man and animal. It was something far deeper, something that could not be explained. Max had been through so much in his life, and I could see that he understood what it was like to be vulnerable, to be abandoned, to be in need of protection. As I stood frozen, watching the scene unfold, I couldn't believe my eyes. Maximum, the lion I had rescued as a cub and watched grow into a powerful creature, was now circling a crying child. There was no logical explanation for what I was witnessing. The animal instincts of lions are primal, their nature dictated by survival and dominance. And yet, here was Max, pacing back and forth, not with the fierce intent of a predator, but with an almost tender curiosity, as though he were trying to understand the child's pain. The boy, barely more than a toddler, seemed oblivious to the danger that loomed so close. His cries were piercing, filled with fear and confusion, but his tiny frame was too exhausted to even attempt to flee. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow across the dusty road, but all I could focus on was the child and the massive lion, whose eyes were locked on him with a strange mixture of caution and concern. I knew I had to act quickly. I had no idea how the boy had ended up here, in the middle of the reserve. But what was clear to me was that this wasn't just a matter of wildlife. Max wasn't hunting. He wasn't preparing to attack. There was something deeply protective in the way he was moving, something that had no place in the animal kingdom I had come to understand. But the lion's behavior suddenly changed. I could see it in his eyes. Something was shifting. Max stopped pacing and stood completely still, his head tilted slightly, his sharp senses picking up something beyond the boy. He raised his head high, his mane flowing in the breeze as his nostrils flared. His body was tense, and I could sense that something was coming. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't good. And then, it came. A low growl rumbled in Max's chest, vibrating the ground beneath me. His golden eyes turned from the boy and darted over his shoulder, where a second lion emerged from the brush. The other lion, a much smaller male, had crept up unnoticed, likely drawn by the boy's cries. The tension in the air was palpable, and I knew, without a doubt, that Max wasn't going to let this intruder harm the child. The second lion charged toward the boy, its eyes focused on the vulnerable figure in front of it. But before it could reach the child, Max leapt into action. He was faster than I had ever seen him, his massive body springing forward with terrifying force. Max's roar echoed through the reserve as he launched himself at the intruder, slamming into it with a deafening thud. The two lions collided, their claws slashing through the air, teeth bared in a vicious display of power. The smaller lion was no match for Maximum. With a few swift moves, Max had it pinned to the ground, roaring in anger as the other lion struggled to free itself. The ground trembled with the force of their struggle. But Max was relentless. He swiped his mighty claws at the intruder, forcing it to retreat. After a brief but intense fight, the second lion finally limped away, its pride clearly lost to Max's dominance. For a moment, the only sound I could hear was the panting of the victorious lion. Max stood over the child, still on alert, scanning the area for any further threats. His golden eyes never once left the boy, and I could see that he wasn't going to move until he was certain the danger had passed. My heart was racing, but I couldn't take my eyes off the scene in front of me. It was as if time had stopped. Here was Maximum, the lion I had rescued, protecting a small, helpless child as fiercely as he would his own cub. I had to act. The boy's safety was paramount, and I knew I had to get him away from the reserve before something else went wrong. I slowly crept towards the jeep, careful not to make any sudden movements that might disturb Maximum. The lion watched me closely, his eyes flicking from me to the boy and back again, as if assessing whether I could be trusted. For a moment, I feared Max might react to my presence the way he would if I were an intruder. But instead, he relaxed. Slowly, he sat down beside the child, his massive form looming over the boy protectively. He let out a low rumble in his chest, a sound that seemed to reassure both me and the child. I could hardly believe it. Maximum, the once orphaned cub I had cared for, was now the protector of this child in need. I knew I couldn't let this moment slip away. With my heart still pounding, I started the jeep and began driving slowly toward the boy. I was careful, inching forward so as not to startle either Max or the child. But as I approached, I could see the boy's frightened face, tear-streaked and exhausted. But there was a sense of comfort in his wide eyes as he looked up at Max. I reached the child's side and cut the engine. The lion didn't move. He simply watched me with those steady, calculating eyes. I knew he was waiting for me to make my next move, to prove that I was a friend, not a threat. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door of the jeep and stepped out slowly. Max didn't react immediately. Instead, he gave me a long, measured look, as if deciding whether or not he could trust me to take care of the child. The seconds felt like hours. But eventually, the lion rose to his feet, stretched his enormous limbs, and took a few steps back. It was as if he had passed the responsibility to me, like he was acknowledging that the child was no longer in danger. With a sense of relief flooding over me, I gently scooped the boy into my arms. Max didn't move far away. He stayed close, watching us carefully, still vigilant. As I carefully placed the child in the jeep and closed the door, I realized just how much had changed. Maximum, the lion who had once needed protection, was now a guardian. I slowly drove the jeep away from the site where Max had stood guard over the boy, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. The world around me seemed to blur, my mind caught between disbelief and awe. The child, still trembling in my arms, had finally stopped crying, though his tear-streaked face remained clouded with confusion. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He couldn't have been more than 4 years old, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. He clutched his little hands to his chest, the tightness in his grip making me wonder what had happened to him before he was left on that road. The sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the road as I navigated through the reserve. I knew I had to get him to the main office. But first, I needed to gather my thoughts. Max had been incredible, his instincts far beyond anything I could have anticipated. But now, with the boy safe, I had questions that needed answering, questions I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. I glanced at the boy again. His small body was slumped against the seat, exhaustion overtaking him after the trauma he had been through. I thought about how, only hours ago, he had been abandoned in a world so vastly different from the one he now found himself in. How could someone leave their child in such a place? And why had he been crying so desperately on the road? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. I had to find out what had happened. But before I could dwell too much on it, I had to focus on the immediate needs of the boy. He needed food, comfort, and stability. I wasn't sure if I could provide any of that, but I would try my best. I wasn't a father, and I certainly wasn't equipped to care for a child. But something inside me stirred. Something that made me want to protect him the same way Max had protected him. When we arrived at the main office, I carefully lifted the boy from the jeep. His small face, so full of sadness and uncertainty, looked up at me with eyes that seemed too old for such a young soul. I could see that he was afraid, not just of the lions, but of everything. The world had clearly been harsh to him. As I carried him inside, I offered him a smile, but I knew it wasn't enough. The boy needed reassurance, something deeper than a kind face or gentle words. I found a seat for him in the small kitchen area, setting him down on a stool and starting to make something simple for him to eat. He sat quietly, watching me with those wide, dark eyes. I noticed how his clothes were ragged and worn. He had clearly been through something difficult. But there was something about him that made me pause. Something that tugged at my heart. He was so small, so fragile, and yet so brave in the face of everything that had happened to him. "Hey, little guy," I said softly, my voice betraying my uncertainty. "What's your name?" He looked up at me but didn't answer. It was clear he was too scared to speak. So I didn't push him. I knew it would take time for him to trust me. The fear in his eyes was too fresh. And though he had been protected by Maximum, the fear of abandonment seemed to still haunt him. After a few minutes, I set a small plate of food in front of him, nothing fancy. Just some bread and fruit I had on hand. I didn't expect much of a response. But when he tentatively picked up a piece of bread and took a bite, I felt a small sense of relief. At least he was eating. I took a seat across from him, watching as he chewed slowly. The silence between us felt heavy, yet somehow comforting. It wasn't the kind of silence I was used to when alone in the reserve. It was the kind of silence that came from two souls in need of understanding, trying to make sense of the world around them. After a few moments, he finally spoke. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "Lion," he said, looking up at me with a mixture of awe and fear. "Big lion. He saved me." His words, though simple, hit me harder than I expected. There was so much emotion behind that statement. The boy had recognized Max for what he was, a protector. And despite everything, he had understood that the lion had meant no harm. "You're right," I said softly, my heart swelling with pride for Maximum. "He saved you." The boy looked down at his plate again, his expression distant. I knew he didn't have the words to explain everything that had happened. I didn't expect him to. But somehow, in his quiet acceptance of what Max had done, I felt the beginning of a bond forming. I glanced at the CCTV footage from the reserve's cameras. The footage that had captured the moment the boy had been abandoned by his parents just outside the reserve boundaries. A battered car had appeared on the screens, driven by a young man with a woman beside him. The woman had looked around cautiously before sneaking through a gap in the fence. Carrying the boy, they placed him on the road, kissed him on the forehead, and then left, driving away without a second glance. I felt sick to my stomach. It was clear to me now that the boy had been abandoned. But why? The kiss on his forehead had been full of tenderness, full of love. But it wasn't enough to keep him. The woman had no choice, no real way out. I couldn't help but think that perhaps they were just trying to protect him from something, poverty, danger, or worse. As I sat there, trying to piece together the fragments of the boy's story, I couldn't help but think about Max and the connection between the two of them. Max had been orphaned, left to fend for himself in a cruel world. And now, here he was, protecting a child who had been abandoned in the same way. It felt like fate had intertwined their paths. And I wondered if, in some strange way, Max had recognized something in the boy that mirrored his own past. The boy finished his food in silence. But the moment I looked up at him, I could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a glimmer of trust. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could start over together. Maybe we could both heal from the pain we had suffered. I wasn't sure how long it would take for the authorities to come, or what would happen to the boy after they arrived. But in that moment, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let him face the world alone. Just as Max had protected him, I would do my best to offer him the safety and love he deserved. And perhaps, just perhaps, I could become something he needed, a guardian in his own right. The days that followed were not easy. I continued to watch over the boy, who, despite his initial fear and confusion, had begun to trust me in small ways. He would smile shyly when I offered him a meal. And every so often, I would catch him watching Max with a newfound admiration. The lion, though a creature of power and wild grace, had become something of a hero in his eyes. It was as if the boy recognized in Max a protector, a creature who understood the pain of being abandoned. Max's instincts were keen, his loyalty unwavering, and in his presence, the boy began to feel a sense of safety that had been absent for too long. One evening, as we sat outside watching the sun dip below the horizon, the boy spoke again. His voice was stronger this time, the stutter of uncertainty replaced by a quiet confidence. "Maximum," he said, pointing to the lion. "He's like my mom, he takes care of me." I looked at Maximum, who sat quietly a few feet away, his golden eyes soft yet watchful, his massive form at rest, as if he were fully aware of the connection he had formed with the boy. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the boy's words sink deep into my heart. Max had taught me something I hadn't fully understood before. In his own way, he had stepped into the role of a guardian, just as he had done with the boy. The way he had protected the child, without hesitation, without fear. It was a lesson in loyalty and unconditional love. He had shown me that sometimes, protection comes not just from blood relations but from unexpected places, from creatures we might not understand, from friends who are willing to stand by us no matter what. Max had learned this in the wilderness, where survival depended on trust and mutual care. Now, he had passed this lesson to the boy and to me. The boy, too, was learning something profound. He was learning that love, in its purest form, doesn't always come in the way we expect it. It doesn't always come from those who are meant to love us. Sometimes, it comes from the most unlikely sources. His parents had left him behind, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of necessity, but they had failed to give him the security and love he deserved. Max had stepped in, a silent guardian, and offered him something that even a parent couldn't always provide, the reassurance that he wasn't alone. The boy was learning that, even in the face of abandonment, there could be love, and he was learning to trust again, even when the world had shown him how easily trust could be broken. As for me, I had learned more than I could have imagined from the events that had unfolded. I had always believed that I understood the world, that I had control over it. As a ranger, my job was to maintain order, to protect the wildlife in the reserve, to follow rules and ensure everything was in balance. But in the course of these few days, I had realized how little I truly knew about what it means to care for someone or something. The lesson from Max had been the most humbling of all. Love is not always something that can be explained or understood. It is something that is given freely, without expectation, without conditions. It doesn't matter if you are human or animal. Sometimes, all we need is a gesture, a quiet presence, to make the world feel safe again. That night, as I lay awake listening to the sounds of the reserve, I reflected on the strange bond that had formed between the boy, Maximum, and myself. We were three broken beings, each of us carrying our own wounds, our own stories of abandonment and loneliness. But together, we had begun to heal. In a world so often defined by chaos and misunderstanding, we had found something simple but profound: the power of connection. The kind of connection that heals, that nurtures, that reminds us that we are never truly alone. In the quiet stillness of the night, I finally understood. The lessons we learn are not always easy or simple, but they are always necessary. We may not always choose the paths we walk, but the lessons we learn along the way about love, empathy, and loyalty are what truly shape us. Maximum, the boy, and I had each learned a piece of this truth. And as the dawn broke over the horizon the next morning, I knew that, in some way, we had all found something worth protecting. Life had a way of surprising us, of showing us that even in the hardest times, there was beauty in the connections we made. And sometimes, those connections came from the most unlikely places.